It was already too late when he saw the sky turn that color. Not gray, not white, but that bleeding kind of dusk, where the clouds drag slow like burlap sacks full of bones, and the wind has no whistle in it, just teeth. The man hadn't spoken in 5 days. He hadn't planned to speak for 10 more. But when he stepped out of the trees that morning and saw the last ridge silhouetted under that haunted sky, he stopped mid-stride and said aloud, "God help me." That's how fast a winter could change in these mountains. He hadn't seen a soul in weeks. He had no name out here. If he ever had one, it had been washed out of memory by the sleet and silence. Folks in town once called him Josiah Mercer, but that name didn't follow him past the first frost. Not after he left the last of them behind. Not after the fever took his boy. Not after he buried the grave too shallow and left the mountain to fill it in. Now it was just one man, one pack, a half-ruined rifle, and 30 miles of snow-wrapped wilderness that had swallowed stronger men for less reason than loneliness. But this storm wasn't normal. He could feel it in his teeth, in his back molars, the kind of ache that only ever came before lightning or death. That sky wasn't threatening snow. It was threatening an ending. He had a half day of daylight left. No firewood, no dugout, no cabin, no root cellar. Just a beaten trail and a prayer. Then he saw it, through a break in the pine brush. There, bent and twisted, nearly flattened beneath 2 rock slides and a windfall tree. A barn, or what had once been one. Half the roof had caved in, the walls bowing inward like they'd been sucking in their own breath for 20 years. But that timber, wide, thick-beamed and blackened with age, was still standing in patches. Some of it had held, a broken spine maybe, but the ribcage was intact. He scrambled toward it like a man reaching for the last breath on earth. Inside was worse. Snow covered the ground from gaping roof breaks, and the back corner was sheared off entirely. Just jagged edges of timber poking out like broken teeth. But he didn't care. He dropped his pack and started clearing the ground like a man possessed. He had 3 hours. 3 hours before the full dark. 4, maybe, before that sky would come down screaming. The man didn't build a shelter so much as tear one from the bones of what remained. He didn't have tools, just a rusted handsaw blade, a camp axe worn to a nub, and fingers that no longer bled when split open. That's how cold he'd gotten inside. He dragged the tree trunk off the roof with a rope harness around his chest, ripped rotten boards off with his bare hands, dug snow out of the corners, and slapped the broken beams back together with strips of saddle leather and iron nails scavenged from the collapsed wall. The barn creaked, groaned, but it didn't fall. When he cleared the central floor, he found something strange beneath a collapsed high rack, a narrow stone trench, just a few inches deep, maybe 10 feet long. It ran in a straight line toward a raised foundation wall that had once supported a feed trough. It wasn't just drainage, it was a channel, dug by hand. Josiah paused, looked at it, and suddenly something old came back to him. Not a memory exactly, but a whisper, a voice from a long time ago. Not a person he could name, but a lesson he'd heard once. Old barns in the mountains sometimes had trench hearths for heating, not for people, but to keep livestock from freezing. The man stood, looked up at the open sky, the wind now shrieking in a pitch that snapped tree limbs like rifle shots. He didn't hesitate. He moved. He piled rubble over the trench, stones, broken planks, old ironwork from the hayloft. He lined the center with pine bark, then dug into his pack and found the last of his pitch, scraped from tree stumps weeks ago, coated it, packed it, built the fire like he was building a last stand. By the time night fell, the trench glowed, a low, slow burn, the kind you could feed with a single log, a stove trench, not warm, but not dead. He laid over it, not directly, but on boards above. The heat rose slow, damp, but it was warmth. For the first time in weeks, the wind howled and didn't bite. He curled on the planks, wrapped in a horse blanket, the faint crackle of fire beneath him, and for a few hours he felt less like a ghost. But at midnight, something cracked outside. Not the wind, something sharper. He sat up, grabbed the rifle. Then he heard it again, a voice, small, muffled. He held his breath. Then again, "Help!" Faint, barely louder than the wind. He moved to the ruined wall, pulled back a board, peered out into the swirling dark. Nothing, then movement, a shadow in the snow, stumbling, and then another. It wasn't one voice, it was 2 children. 2 children stumbling through the snow, barely upright, barely visible, holding each other. Not ghosts, real. Their eyes caught his only for a second before one collapsed, the other following just seconds after. He didn't even think. He ran. By the time he dragged them inside, The first was unconscious, the second barely able to whisper. They were skin and bone, not dressed for this storm, not from around here. He didn't ask questions. He didn't have to. They were dying, and now his fire trench wasn't just his. He wrapped them, one on either side of him, gave them his coat, then his blanket, then whatever warmth was left in his bones. And still, it wasn't enough. Their skin was ice. Their breath came in shudders. The fire had to last the night, but there was almost no wood left. He stood, tore apart the rest of the collapsed feed rack, burned the last of the hay, broke apart the frozen door, and fed it plank by plank. By dawn, his hands were raw, his back was bruised from hauling beams. But the fire was alive, so were the children. He didn't sleep. He sat upright all night, watching. Watching the sky lighten behind the ruined roof, watching their breath grow stronger. The girl was maybe 10, the boy younger. He didn't know their names, but he knew now he wasn't going to die in this barn, and neither were they, not if he could help it. And that was when the real work began. The storm didn't ease by morning. It worsened. The wind had lost its voice and taken on something worse. Pressure, a kind of silence that throbbed inside the ears like a weight dropped on the world. Snow fell in long horizontal sheets that looked like dust blown off the bones of giants. But inside that barn, under a roof cobbled from broken trusses and wrapped in grief and willpower, 3 people were breathing. The boy coughed first, just once. It was weak and sharp, but real. Josiah knelt beside him without speaking, fed another sliver of wood into the fire trench, and watched the child's cracked lips tremble toward a word. But nothing came, just a cough again. The girl stirred next, her eyes flickering open like a door too heavy to lift. And when she saw the man sitting cross-legged beside them, coatless, eyes sunken, hands red from cold and work, she shrank. Josiah didn't reach for her, didn't even blink. He just set the old tin cup beside her, steam rising off the snow melt inside, and scooted back. "You're safe," he said. It came out rough, hoarse. "Fire's real. You're not dreaming." The girl didn't answer. Her fingers slowly moved toward the cup, then pulled it into her chest like it was gold. Josiah turned, didn't push. If he'd learned one thing from a year in the mountains, it was how not to press too hard when something broke. Trust came slow, and not at all for some. He started the day by hauling down the rest of the wall planks still hanging loose on the windward side. The barn's northeast edge had taken the worst of the snow, drifted up nearly 4 feet high, threatening to bury the whole side of the shelter. He cut a narrow passage between beams, shoveling out the snow with an old pitchfork head and his bare arms, then packed it into a crude windbreak outside the gap, hoping to slow the worst of the blow. He didn't dare burn more wood. The feed rack was gone, the door gone, the siding nearly all stripped. Every hour counted now. By midday, the boy had sat up. He was small for maybe 8 years old. His eyes were wide and sunken, but alert now, still silent. The girl hadn't spoken either, but both were watching Josiah now as he worked, watching like a trapped animal watches the shape of a rescuer's hands. When Josiah returned to the fire trench and fed it a single split of barked pine, the boy's voice finally broke through. "You from the valley?" Josiah didn't look up at first. He nudged the log into place, propped it so the heat would draw steady, and only then turned. "Long past it," he said. "Ain't much left there anymore." The girl shifted her weight. She looked thinner in the light, her shoulders like sticks under the worn dress. Her lips moved. "We walked from Grand Ridge." Josiah blinked. That was 12 miles east, through canyon draws and broken slopes. No child should have been out in this storm, let alone that far. "How long?" he asked. The boy looked down, shrugged. "A day, maybe 2. We were with Ma. She told us to go ahead, said she'd follow. That was all. No tears, no cries, just silence after that." Josiah felt something stir in his gut, not pity. He didn't believe in that anymore, not after the grave, not after the way his son's skin turned gray in that last week of fever. This was something else, a responsibility, a reckoning. He stood. "We're gonna need more than scraps if we're gonna last through another night. You're warm enough to keep low, keep the fire fed?" The girl nodded slowly. "Good, I'll be gone an hour, maybe 2. If the fire dips, you feed it 1 stick at a time. No more. Keep the smoke low. If the wind changes, dam the draft with that blanket." He didn't wait for an answer, just pulled on what was left of his coat, wrapped a bark fiber scarf around his neck, and shoved open the broken slat that passed for a door. The outside had turned into a nightmare. The snow was waist deep now, and the drifts along the barn's north side had solidified into ice sheets. He moved with the gait of a man wading through water that hated him, but he didn't stop. There was something he remembered. Half a mile back up the trail, tucked under a rock ledge, a split cedar snag, too damp to burn hot, but thick with fibers, and if he could drag it back, strip the core and split it right, it would keep their trench lit through the next dusk. It took him 3 hours of blinding wind and snow that stripped the heat out of his bones like acid. His gloves were gone long ago, his fingers turned black with pitch and blood, but he dragged that cedar log back through the storm, like a mule with no name. He staggered through the door not long after the sky dimmed again. The light in the barn was low, but the children were alive. The girl had fed the fire. The boy had scraped snow melt into the cup. Josiah dropped the cedar log like a gift from God. "Good," he croaked. "That's good." The girl spoke again that night. "I'm Ruth." Her voice was barely louder than the crackle of the fire, but it stopped Josiah mid-motion. He looked up. "Ruth," he echoed. "And him? My brother's name is Eli." Josiah nodded. "You keep that name close, Eli. It's a good one." There was quiet after that, a warm one, but not for long. Sometime past midnight, Josiah heard a sound. Not the storm, not the wind. Voices, real voices, not in his head, not the children. Low, adult, speaking in harsh tones, muffled by distance and snow, but close enough to carry through the cracks in the barn siding. He moved fast. He smothered the fire down with wet ash, grabbed the rifle and crouched low at the back wall. The children huddled close behind him, silent, not breathing. Outside, footsteps, crunching, slow, intentional. Then a voice. "I'm telling you, it's in there. I saw smoke last night." Another voice, raspier. "So what? Some trapper? Dead by now anyhow." "No, there was movement. Figures. Maybe 3. Might be game in there. Or other kind." A pause, then laughter. Dry, cold. Josiah tensed. Raiders weren't common in these mountains, but they existed. Desperate men in desperate years, driven by hunger, cold, or worse. He peeked through a crack in the wall. 2 shapes, one with a long coat and a hunting bow slung over the shoulder, the other dragging something behind him, a sled or a stretcher. They were headed for the barn door. Josiah had 1 shot in the chamber, 4 more in the stock, but that rifle hadn't been true in months, and the wind could jam the bolt with a sneeze of ice. He didn't move. Instead, he whispered low. "Back wall, crawl to the corner, stay behind the haystones. Don't speak, don't move, no matter what happens." Ruth obeyed without question, pulled Eli with her. Josiah crept to the fire trench, took 1 smoldering coal and crushed it into a damp pine shaving. The flame flickered, dim, but enough. He slid to the far corner, behind the broken feed rack, and waited. The barn door creaked open. Boots stepped in. The wind howled louder behind them. Then a voice again. "Empty. Looks abandoned." The second man stepped inside, kicked snow aside. Then a pause. "There's heat here," he said. Josiah's hand gripped the rifle tighter. The man bent low, examining the trench. Then something cracked. The loose floorboard, where Ruth had sat, a sound barely louder than a breath. But it was enough. "Wait," the first man said, and that was when Josiah stepped forward, slow, from the dark, rifle raised. "If you take another step," he said, voice flat, "I'll split your lungs with pine." The 2 men froze. The second one turned. Josiah didn't blink. "Who are you?" the first man spoke. "Just looking for shelter." "Swear it." Josiah gestured with the barrel. "Plenty of trees out there. This place is full. Move on." The second man narrowed his eyes. "You've got food. I've got 2 children under the floor and 1 bullet left. You really want to see if I'm lying?" They didn't. The first man muttered something, turned, and the second one followed. Slowly, reluctantly, but they backed out, left into the storm, gone. Josiah waited a full 10 minutes before lowering the rifle. When he did, his hands were shaking, not from fear, from the cold. He'd stood there too long without gloves, too long without fire. By morning, his fingertips were blue, but the children were still alive, and the barn was still standing. He fed the trench with the cedar he'd dragged, and they made it through the second night. But Josiah knew then they'd have to build something more. The barn wouldn't hold forever, and if more men came, it wouldn't hold at all. By the 3rd morning, the storm had not broken. It had worsened. The barn's roof sagged lower with every gust. Snow pressed down with the weight of another world. And Josiah woke to the cracking sound of an overhead beam, timber splintering just enough to shift the air and sprinkle dust across his face. He rolled from his makeshift bunk instantly, heart pounding, hands reaching not for warmth or food, but for the rifle, then the children. They were both still curled near the fire trench, huddled under what was left of his blanket, too cold to stir. He hadn't slept more than a few hours that night, and not deeply. The run-in with those scavengers had left a new weight in his chest, not fear exactly, but anticipation, a dread that didn't announce itself, only crouched in the corners of his thoughts and waited for things to go wrong. He knelt and checked the girl's cheek with the back of his hand, warm, then the boy's chest, still rising, slow but steady. Then he looked up. That beam, it wouldn't last another night. There was no choice anymore. The shelter had to become more than shelter. It had to become a fortress, not in the way of stone and cannon, but in the way of roots, in the way a man must dig into the earth like a creature desperate to keep breathing through the deepest snows of the season. Josiah didn't tell the children the whole of it, but by noon he had them helping, Ruth folding fabric into tight bundles to dam the wall gaps, Eli helping stack stones to line the lower half of the trench. Josiah moved with the brutal precision of a man who'd had this in the back of his mind for years. It wasn't just repair work anymore, it was strategy. First, reinforce the walls. He stripped the interior to the bones. Every loose slat, every broken rail or decayed beam he could reach, he pulled down and realigned, bracing the leaning side walls with cross planks hammered at a slant, burying the bases in frozen earth to lock them against collapse. Second, the roof. The south side was the worst, nearly gone entirely, but that meant it had already dropped the worst of its snow load. Josiah scavenged the remaining slats and ran them low, reshaping the fall to draw snow away from the ridge and give the roof a slant to shed accumulation. Then he layered bark sheets and pine boughs over it, weaving them tight with soaked rope to keep the wind from peeling it apart. Third, heat. The trench had been a miracle. But miracles were temporary. The cedar stash would run dry by nightfall, and the mountain would not give more without blood. So Josiah made the hardest choice. He left the children. Not for long, not far. Just down the ridge, to where the tree line thickened again. But it was enough to make Ruth's eyes widen, and Eli's fingers clutch the hem of his coat. "I'll be fast," Josiah said. "You stay here, keep the trench fed. If I'm not back by nightfall, shut the door tight and pile snow against it." "Don't go," Eli said. Josiah knelt beside him. "I'll come back. That I swear." The boy didn't answer, just nodded once. A child's gesture, but Josiah felt it like a knife. He didn't tell them what he feared. He feared the scavengers. He feared the storm worsening. And most of all, he feared the look in his own eyes that morning when he saw his reflection in the ice-sheeted wall. Wild, sunken, hollow-cheeked. He looked like a man coming back from death, or maybe heading straight into it. The walk to the trees took an hour. The drifts were shoulder-high in places, and Josiah had to dig footholds with every step. When he reached the woods, he didn't waste time. He found a downed pine, split at the base but thick with dry branches, and started cutting. The cold made his axe hand numb after 10 minutes. He kept cutting. By the time the pile was ready to drag, he had to lash it with rope and haul it behind him like a sled. His legs trembled with effort. His breath fogged so thick he could hardly see. He made it halfway back before he heard it. A scream, not distant, close, a child's voice. Ruth. He dropped the rope instantly, ran, stumbled through the snow, boots catching in drifts, breath heaving out of his chest like smoke. He tore up the ridge, around the bend, to the barn's outer wall, and froze. The door was open, not blown, not cracked, open. A trail of prints led away from it. 2 sets. Small, dragging, and then another set, large, boots. Josiah moved like a wolf unleashed. He barreled through the door, rifle raised, and saw the blood. Just a smear on the far wall, a smear and a piece of rope, then a sound behind him. Not wind, a footstep. He spun, too slow. A figure crashed into him from the side. They hit the ground hard. The rifle clattered free. Josiah swung with his elbow, caught the man in the ribs, rolled, then drove his knee into the figure's chest. But the other was strong, maybe younger, wiry with starvation and rage. They grappled in the snow, fists slamming into frozen earth, hands clawing for advantage. Then Josiah's hand closed around something solid. The hatchet. He swung, not to kill, but to end the fight. The back of the blade cracked across the man's jaw. Bone snapped, teeth spilled. The figure dropped. Josiah stood, panting, covered in sweat that froze before it hit the ground. Then he heard it again. "Help! Josiah!" Ruth's voice, from the woods. He didn't hesitate. He ran, blind. He followed the trail through the trees, heart pounding, vision blackening at the edges from exhaustion and cold. He stumbled over roots, slipped on ice, but kept moving. Then, a clearing, a figure dragging something small. Eli and Ruth, running behind, screaming, swinging a stick with all the force her small arms could muster. Josiah didn't shout. He charged. The man dragging Eli never saw it coming. Josiah hit him like an avalanche, shoulder first, full force. They both hit the snow. This time Josiah didn't hesitate. He raised the hatchet again, but the man surrendered before it fell, hands raised, bleeding from the mouth. "Don't, please. I thought he had food. He was alone." Josiah stared down at him. "You lay hands on a child again. and I'll bury you so deep the crows won't even know you existed." He left the man there, bleeding, crying into the snow like a whipped dog. He gathered Eli into his arms, still breathing, just stunned, and led Ruth back with one hand in hers, dragging his rifle behind him. They made it back to the barn by dusk. He barred the door, rebuilt the fire, wrapped the children close, and this time, when the night came, it didn't feel like death was scratching at the door. It felt like it had already tried and been turned away. Still, the barn wouldn't last. Josiah knew it now. Down to his marrow. Come spring thaw, the whole structure would rot through, and even before then, the weight of the snow might crack it open like a skull. So he made a decision. "We dig," he said that next morning. Ruth blinked. "What?" "A burrow. Underneath, like a cellar. If we go deep enough, we can keep warm with no fire at all. Earth's better insulation than wood or bark. But the floor, I'll break it. We'll make a new one, and we won't die in a roof collapse." It took a week. Each day was work beyond belief. Josiah dug with his bare hands. Then with a half-rusted shovel, he unearthed from under a pile of hay that had frozen so hard it cracked when struck. The children helped, not because they were told to, but because something in them had changed. Eli followed Josiah silently, mimicking every movement. Ruth gathered stones for lining the tunnel, soaking bark for insulation, weaving straw panels to lie across the hollowed-out floor. They became a unit, not a family, not yet, but something close. By the 8th day, the burrow was finished, a slope carved into the earth under the back wall, supported with stacked stone and braced beams. The floor was straw and bark, and the entrance hidden behind the old trough. It could fit 3 people, barely, but it was warm. They moved inside that night. Josiah lit no fire. They didn't need it. The earth gave off a low, slow heat that held through the darkness. And in the silence of that underground den, with Ruth curled to his right, and Eli's fingers gripped around his own, Josiah felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not peace, not safety, but purpose. And when the wind shrieked over the mountains again, louder than ever before, he closed his eyes and slept. The wind didn't stop. Not that night, not the next. It howled for 6 days straight, like the mountain itself was screaming, like something buried under ice had finally woken up angry and wanted the whole world to remember it. But Josiah and the children were no longer in its reach. The earth held them. Inside the burrow, buried beneath 4 feet of dirt and bark, lined with stone and covered with straw mats, they were wrapped in something deeper than warmth, something that felt like survival earned. The place smelled of pine and pitch, and the breath they shared condensed into fog on the dirt ceiling. But no frost formed, and that meant everything. They had made it past the point where most people died. Josiah sat up every few hours during those first nights underground, checking the makeshift air hole he'd cut through the slope, listening for roof collapse, watching the walls for seep or sag. He had little faith in permanence. He believed in pressure and time, and he knew both came fast in the mountains. But the burrow held, and slowly a rhythm formed. They woke when the dim light shifted behind the snow-covered cracks in the barn wall. They rationed pine nuts and dried squirrel meat Josiah had hidden months before. They melted snow for water in a battered iron pot, using slivers of bark sparingly in a tiny rock-ringed hearth Josiah had built into the burrow floor, just enough to warm, not to cook. Josiah didn't speak much, but the children did. Ruth began to talk freely. She told him about their mother, about how she'd gotten sick near the valley, about how she'd told them to go ahead toward the ridgeline while she rested, how she never followed. "She said we'd find something," Ruth whispered one morning as Josiah was stacking bark at the tunnel mouth. "Said someone always survives past the tree line. Someone always makes it." Josiah didn't answer. He didn't have anything to give her but a nod, a silent promise that he'd be that someone. On the 7th day, the wind finally eased. Not completely, but enough that the world sounded like itself again. Trees groaning instead of shrieking, snow falling instead of slashing sideways. The sunlight, when it pierced through the cracked slats of the barn, looked like light again, not the blade of a dying world. Josiah took it as a sign. "It's time," he said to Ruth. She was brushing Eli's hair, trying to untangle it with her fingers. She looked up. "Time for what?" "To check the ridgeline, to find what else survived." She didn't argue. He packed before noon, wrapped the rifle, stuffed a few strips of bark jerky into a ragged pouch, slung the axe over his back, left most of his coat with the children, layering himself in stitched bark and hide to block the wind. "You stay in the burrow," he said. "Even if it gets quiet? Even if you hear things? Don't come out till I do?" Ruth nodded. Eli gave a small wave. He didn't speak much still, but his eyes said enough. Josiah stepped out into a world that looked like it had forgotten humans ever lived. Snow to the waist, ice sheets over everything that once had a name. Trees cracked in half. A silence. that rang with judgment. He moved slow, careful not to overstep his strength. The trail was gone, but his memory was better than frost. He followed the contours of the land by feel. Each ridge, each draw, each bend of the earth stored somewhere in him like a map burned into muscle. It took him till dusk to reach the ridgeline. When he crested it, his heart clenched. Below him, black smoke, rising slow, not a wildfire, not a flare, a cabin, a small one, maybe 3 miles out, and someone alive in it. He turned back fast, knees pounding as he retraced his trail, sliding down snowbanks, stumbling through drifts, but he made it back before full dark. When he burst into the barn, Ruth leapt up. "Someone's out there," he panted. "Cabin down in the hollow. Smoke coming from the stack. We ain't the last." She stared, eyes wide. Eli just grinned, small and crooked, but real. Josiah leaned against the wall, exhausted. He didn't plan to go down that night. He needed one more day to rest, to make a plan. But the knowledge sat in him like fire. They weren't alone, and that changed everything. The next morning he went, left early. This time he took extra wood, a wrapped bundle of meat, and both children's names in his heart-like weight. The hike down to the cabin took 2 hours. He didn't approach directly, circled wide, watched. Smoke still came steady, no shouting, no tracks in or out. Finally he approached. It was a trapper's cabin, old and square, with a stone base and a patchwork tin roof. One shutter hung loose. A lantern flickered behind frost-covered glass. He knocked once. The door creaked open a crack. A woman's face appeared, worn, eyes rimmed red, a rifle aimed square at his chest. He raised his hands slowly. "I'm alone," he said. "Don't mean harm. Where's your camp?" she asked, voice raw. "Up the ridge. Barn. I've got 2 kids with me." That made her pause. "Your own?" Josiah shook his head. "Not by blood, but mine now." She lowered the rifle a hair. "You from the north side?" she asked. He nodded. She hesitated, then opened the door. Inside was warmer than anything Josiah had felt in weeks. She had a stove, a real one, fed by split alder logs, glowing orange. "Come in, but quick," she said. "Don't let the heat out." He stepped in, took one breath, and felt dizzy. Warmth did that, made the cold you'd been holding collapse all at once. "I'm Claire," she said, setting down the rifle. "Josiah. Those kids, where'd you find them?" "East Trail. Lost. Been in the barn with me near 10 days now." She nodded. "I heard voices 2 nights ago. Thought I was imagining." "You weren't. You got food?" "Enough, but not for long." She sat. "I got a daughter," she said. "Up the trail with neighbors. We got split when the storm came through. I've been trying to find a way to reach her, but the wind." Josiah nodded. "I'll help." She looked up, surprised. "You don't even know me. I know the cold. That's enough." They traded supplies. She gave him coals in a sealed pot to carry back. He gave her half their dried meat. They drew a rough map, where her daughter might be, where the paths forked, how deep the drifts ran. When he left, she pressed something into his hand, a silver locket. "Give it to her if I don't make it," she said. Josiah didn't answer, just nodded once. He made it back to the barn before dark again. When he told Ruth and Eli about the woman, about the daughter, Ruth's face lit up. "There are more," she said. Josiah looked into the fire. "Maybe more than we think." The next day, they moved. He took them to the cabin. Claire opened the door before he knocked. "God," she whispered, "they're just kids. They're stronger than they look," Josiah said. She let them in. They sat near the stove. Ruth smiled for the first time in a way that looked like sunlight. Josiah stood. "I'm going back tomorrow," he said, "to find the girl." Claire's hands shook. "I'll come," she said, but Josiah shook his head. "Keep them warm. That's more important." He left before sunrise the next morning, tracking over ridgelines and valleys half choked with snow. He followed Claire's map, watched the sky, marked trees with his knife so he could find his way back. By mid-afternoon, he saw it, a dugout cabin half covered in snow. Smoke. He approached slow, knocked. A teenage girl opened the door, eyes wide. "Claire's daughter?" The girl nodded. "She's alive," Josiah said. "She sent me." Tears came fast. They made it back over 2 days. Slow, careful. The girl's name was Anna. She talked about her mother non-stop. When Claire saw her, she fell to her knees. Josiah stood back, watched, then turned toward the barn, back to where it all started. It was nearly crushed now. The roof had fully fallen, the walls bowed, the snow had nearly swallowed it, but the burrow still held. Josiah knelt beside it, pressed his hand to the earth. "Thank you," he said, then turned and walked back to the cabin, back to warmth, back to what, for the first time in years, felt like home. Spring didn't come all at once. It never did in the mountains. First came the change in sound. The wind no longer howled like it was dragging chains, but whispered through the trees, soft enough that you could hear your own breath again. Then the birds began to return, not in full chorus, but one by one, hesitant like scouts testing a hostile land. Last came the melt, not a thaw, not a flood, but a slow weeping. Snow dripping from the eaves of Claire's cabin, icicles falling with quiet thuds from the ledges, frost loosening its grip on the bark of trees and the skin of men. By then, Josiah had grown used to the sound of footsteps other than his own. Claire's boots on the floorboards as she stoked the fire, Ruth's soft shuffle as she fetched water, Eli's bare feet scampering around the small cabin like a squirrel too fast to catch. Even Anna, Claire's daughter, now back under the same roof, had taken to moving softly from corner to corner, helping repair clothes, stack wood, and patch cracks in the cabin's seams. And Josiah? He hadn't spoken much more than he had in the barn. But he'd changed. He no longer sat alone with his back to the wall. He no longer woke 3 times each night with a hand on the rifle stock. He no longer ate last or apart. He belonged, or something like it. Still, his eyes kept returning to the ridgeline, to the barn, to what was left. He walked back there one morning, just after the ground had begun to soften beneath the pines. Ruth followed him without asking. She didn't speak. She just knew where he was headed, and she fell in step like she'd done it her whole life. When they reached the site, Josiah stopped short. The barn had collapsed fully, a heap of broken timber and half-buried stones. The snow had melted in uneven patches, revealing the twisted ribs of the old structure. It looked like the carcass of something once alive, a beast felled by years of storms. But beneath the wreckage, the ground hadn't sunk. The burrow was still there. Josiah knelt, brushed aside pine needles and snow-crusted straw. The tunnel entrance had caved in, but the earth above was still hard-packed. The walls had held. The shape was still there. "You built this?" Ruth asked. Quiet. Josiah nodded. "We did." She crouched beside him, ran her hand across the earth. "We lived here. We survived here," Josiah corrected. He looked at the heap of broken beams, the pieces of the past they'd left behind. He stood, picked up a jagged board, and began to stack, not to rebuild, but to bury. Ruth joined him. They worked in silence for over an hour, piling the remains of the barn into a crude cairn. Not tall, not neat, but deliberate. A grave marker maybe, a tribute. When it was done, Josiah stepped back and looked at it, hands on his hips, breathing steady. "Fire took it," he said, more to himself than her. "Snow too, but it gave back more than it took." Ruth nodded. "It gave us you." That made Josiah pause. He looked down at her, this girl who had walked out of a blizzard with frostbitten fingers, and a brother too weak to speak. She had every right to have died. But she hadn't, because she'd kept walking, because her mother had believed someone would be there on the other side, because Josiah had been just far enough from the edge of giving up that day to step into that ruined barn and try to make something hold. They walked back slowly. Claire met them at the porch. She was wiping her hands on a rag, flour on her apron. She had started baking again. The stove could hold heat now. The firewood was stacked high. They had enough salted meat and dried roots to last into the summer. More if they rationed. She looked at Josiah and nodded once. "No wolves?" "Just bones," he said. He stepped inside. The cabin smelled like bread. Eli was snoring softly on a pile of blankets near the stove. Anna was stitching something. A patch on Josiah's coat, he realized. With bark fiber thread she'd pulled herself. Josiah sat, not in a corner, not away from them, but right in the middle, near the stove, near the heart of it. Claire handed him a cup of hot broth. He took it. "You staying?" she asked. The question hung in the air, not heavy, not loud. He didn't answer immediately, just sipped the broth, looked around the cabin, at the girl who followed him up the ridge, at the boy who now laughed in his sleep instead of shivering, at the woman who had fed him without asking for anything in return. And then he said, "I reckon I already did." That night they all slept in the same room. The stove burned slow. The wind outside had dropped to almost nothing. Just a whisper now. A reminder. Spring wasn't safety. It never was. The mountain could change again. But they were ready this time. They had each other. They had earth and wood and fire, and the memory of a barn that shouldn't have stood, a man who shouldn't have survived, and children who shouldn't have made it, but did, because someone turned ruin into refuge, because someone chose not to give up, because shelter wasn't walls or roofs or fire. It was hands that stayed when others left. It was names learned in the dark. It was the sound of breathing that wasn't your own. And it was the silence afterward, soft, deep, earned. When Josiah finally closed his eyes that night, the firelight casting slow shadows across the cabin walls, he felt something he'd buried years ago stir in his chest again. Not sorrow, not hope, but something older, something steadier, like roots, like shelter, like home.